So now we are going to formally start our first keynote session, which will celebrate a celebration of the life and work of Sir David Cox. It is difficult to overstate just how important and influential Sir David Cox was to the statistical sciences and how much he was respected and cherished by those who had the good fortune to work with and learn from him. The Royal Statistical Society describes Sir David as one of the most important statisticians of the past century, and you would struggle to find anyone who would argue with that, except maybe for Sir David himself. Because despite all his achievements in life, Sir David was always a thoroughly humble man. David Firth, who is here with us, one of Sir David's former PhD students, wrote in Significance in the commemoration issue in April 2022 that his friend and colleague was, quote, not only a brilliant scientist, but also a friendly person who was uncommonly generous with his time. And he also wrote that he was an unassuming man with a dry and often self-deprecating sense of humor. And I think we absolutely all have experienced that. Those who knew David well have many personal anecdotes that attest to these aspects of Sir David's character. And we may hear other stories from our invited speakers, Nanny Wermuth, Nancy Reid, and Ruth Keogh. But there are countless other examples. For instance, in an interview with Sir David from last year, Stanford professor Trevor Hastie and Robert Tibshirani brought up Sir David 1972 paper, Regression Models and Life Tables. This paper, published in the Journal of the Royal Society Series B, has been cited more than 58,000 times, according to Google, and for good reason. It is the paper in which Sir David developed the proportional hazards model that is now often simply referred to as the Cox model. And for this idea, Sir David won the inaugural 2016 International Prize in Statistics, which is the highest honor in the field of statistics. In making this award, Susan Ellenberg, the chair of the International Prize in Statistics Foundation, said, I quote, Professor Cox changed how we analyze and understand the effect of natural or human-induced risk factors on survival outcomes, paving the way for powerful scientific inquiry and discoveries that have impacted human health worldwide. But when speaking to Trevor Hastie and Robert Tibshirani about this paper, Sir David modestly described its success as somewhat of a fluke. We'll now see a clip from
So David, that paper has become so famous. At the time you wrote it, did you have an idea that was going to be a big breakthrough?
No, I thought it was answering a question that, in the sense that 4 or 5 different people, some American, some British, 5 or 6 different people had all said, this is an important problem that we want solved. So in the sense that I'd done that, I felt something had been achieved, but how important it was, well, who's no idea really. It's somewhat of a fluke, an issue of timing, that it happens to get so much attention.
Well, as you look back at it now, you've written over 300 papers. Now, is it a paper one of the papers you're the most proud of?
It's the most.
Is it one of your papers that you are very proud of now, looking back after 50 years?
Ooh. I think I'm pleased if it helped people analyze data well. I'm very, very happy. Let's put it like that.
Sir David's 1972 paper is not his only famous, highly cited contribution to the literature. In his significance article, David first highlights 5 greatest hits and 6 personal favorites. But there are many more publications to choose from. Over a period of more than 70 years, Sir David published 302 peer-reviewed articles and 23 books. Among those publications are quite a number of review papers. Referring to review papers, David says, this typifies David's selflessness. A high-quality review paper represents a lot of work for the author and is an immensely valuable resource for current and future researchers. But such papers are often not even recognized as research contribution. And we all agree with that, the undervalue of review papers. Yet, it was very much like Sir David to want to encourage and support other researchers. He supervised 64 PhD students, according to the Mathematical Genealogy Project, but many, many more statisticians benefited from his teaching, insight, and intellect as a collaborator, a co-author, a colleague. Sir David died on the 18th of January, 2022, at the age of 97. In a personal remembrance earlier this year, Virginia Tech Deborah Mayo wrote, "In celebrating Cox's immense contributions, we should recognize how much there is yet to learn from him." We will now see another.
Well, I said a bit about yesterday and a bit about today. Tomorrow, well, I wish I knew. What we have to ask ourselves, there's no doubt at all, there's a ferment of activity in our subject across many areas of application, which is excellent. Are there fundamental ideas being put forward? Well, some. Are they going to be fruitful? Nobody knows. Remember my analogy with the wave. So, are there new things going on? I don't know. Now, there's a general moral that's implicit in quite a few of the things I've said, which is the role of caution for the statistician. It's very easy to be put in the position that you spend a fair bit of time saying to people, well, look, you've done this study, but actually your conclusions don't really follow from it. Either your study design is defective or the sample size isn't big enough to justify the conclusions you want. And that can be, particularly perhaps in the medical context, a totally necessary and desirable thing to do. But as I said earlier, scientific research is not for the cautious. It's an adventurous process. And so how do we fulfill our role of necessary caution and yet at the same time not go over the top in negativity? And the answer must be something like the balance between what I called analysis and interpretation. The more we can interlink the two, interpretation is more imaginative, more uncertain, is trying to say what's really going on in this problem. The more we can get involved in that side of thing, analysis, almost by definition, have to be quite cautious. But there's, I think, a real challenge there of playing a role of necessary skepticism, but going a bit too far with it. Well, I've talked about yesterday a bit about today, not very much about tomorrow, so I better stop there with that question mark. Thank you very much.
It's very moving to see this audio clip. Anyway, we're now going to carry on with the session, and we are lucky to hear from 3 close colleagues of David, close colleagues and friends of David who've come and are going to share with us their work, their memories, their collaborations. I will first call on Nanny Wermuth. Nanny Wermuth received her PhD in statistics from Harvard University and then a habilitation as Professor of Medical Statistics from the University of Mainz. Jointly with Sir David Cox, she received a Max Planck Research Prize for International Outstanding Research in 1992. And the well-known monograph, Multivariate Dependencies, by Cox and Wermuth was published in 1994. Since 2003, Nanny has been Professor of Biostatistics at the Chalmers Technical University and the University of Gothenburg. This is an incredibly brief resume for Nanny, but I'm sure you are very keen to hear directly from her. So Nanny, can I invite you to join us?
I take that one. So, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your nice introduction. And I'll try to share with you some of my beautiful experience working with David Cox. So, Oh, okay, this was too fast. So you know already that I have been working in Gothenburg and in Mainz. And here is one of the beautiful pictures of David by a professional photographer, Jane Brown, in 1992. Statisticians have an exciting field of research because they design empirical studies, they formulate and evaluate models and methods of analysis. They interpret evidence and data and results of statistical analysis, just as David described it in the video. And this is the reason why this field is so exciting as such. And we have heard already that David has contributed enormously to each of these special aspects. In addition, he has, for example, edited Biometrica for 25 years and read every paper that was published there in the time. He supervised more than 60 PhD students, but he supported even more, many more colleagues. It is an honor and a pleasure to speak about my time with David. And I want to mention the early contacts. At a European meeting of statisticians in '81 in Wrocław, I heard him give a lecture for the first time on interactions. And this paper was published a few years later in the International Statistical Review. And I was completely unimpressed. Then, at an RSS meeting on medical statistics in Basel, 1983, we talked for the first time to each other. And he told me much later that he was shocked that I had not responded well to his suggestions. Then the next encounter was at a session of the International Statistical Institute a few years later in Amsterdam. And he had lost all his slides in a suitcase. But he still gave a very nice lecture. So why, after these first meetings, did we start to work together? I have to move here too. Yeah. One of my early papers got rejected by the second editor of Psychometrica. And I was very upset. So one of my colleagues, either it was Peter McCulloch or Terry Speed, I don't remember, suggested to contact David and ask him for advice. And surprisingly, at a time when it would still take often more than 2 years until you your first, after a submission of paper again, David had answered within 2 days, and he gave a very encouraging summary of the paper. And I think, and his move to a social science college in Oxford started our 30 years of most enjoyable and productive cooperation. Now I show you a few pictures, and they are supposed to show that David seemed to have barely aged in this time period. So here is the first one, also with the next speaker at a conference in Waterloo, I believe. It is David Cox, Nancy Reid, John Fraser, and John Elder. Don Fraser. So, next one. Agnes Herzberg, David Cox, and Maurice Bartlett in 1990. Sorry? It didn't show. Okay. So, and then there was the International Statistical Institute conference in Florence, and you can see my husband, me, and David walking together somewhere. Oops. Here you find an evening session at one of the many workshops I organized over the years with nice colleagues. And here you see David Puckeltheim and Stephen Stiegler. Here is a nice picture with a colleague in Florence, taken in the spring of 2014. And here you have a last picture from Oxford, when there was a little workshop to celebrate his 90th birthday. Oh, this was it. So, we worked mainly on graphs and the effects for models that correspond to them. And the most important type of graph we used was a regression graph, I think, jointly. And if we have nodes in the graph, they represent variables. And if we have two nodes, I and j, in a set of n nodes, then this regression graph has 3 types of edge. And I show you a picture in a minute I'm sorry, something is going wrong. Well, yeah. It must be awful to follow this. So our joint work was mainly on analyzing data and developing methods. And with data on many variables, the main features are to think about the background and the context of the study, to think about responses to regressors, which are explanatory variables, and about conditional independence, which simplify interpretation. We use always the available knowledge about variables, for instance, their order and their dependencies. And we look at chances to replicate the results, which is not always obvious. David's recommendations during the many years of joint work was try to use simple cases and convincing notation, and do not give up if you don't find the important results proven in a nice way soon. Sorry, I could have used just without slides. Huh? Oh yeah. This is a mess up. So, we have these three types of edge, and here is a little example of a regression graph that is well fitting to a set of data in psychology. And there's only one known linear dependence in this whole set of data. And in all, you can see direct dependencies and indirect dependencies or pathways of dependence. So, we developed a notation for marginalizing and conditioning. If we cross out a node, it means we marginalize over it. If we fix it in a vec, we condition on it. And then the different types of three-node graphs are either edge-inducing, after conditioning, or after marginalizing. And we use not the induced edges that were in the original graph for the transition node. We replaced this by just dashed lines to remember that the direction is not applied and to avoid cluttering large graphs with unnecessary errors. So did I forget to change our notation for marginalizing and conditioning? Oh. Did you see anything? I'm sorry about this.
I think.
I'm trying to. So we had marginalizing. You should scream immediately when you don't see what I'm talking about. Sorry. Sorry about this. So here's an example of marginalizing over a common explanatory variable which is more than 100 years old. And we next see how David Cox proved that for binary variables, such a common source V has zero partial correlations. And these were the types of slides we would get in the psychology department, and my research assistants and colleagues would say, oh, the fax with all the worms on it has arrived again. So you didn't see it and you didn't scream. Why can I not change? Because I don't press on the right button. Okay, so this is the type of slide you get from David, sometimes there, very complicated, and sometimes much simpler. So essential to us was also that there are two different types of interpretation of the graphs. Can I have 3 more minutes because I messed it up? When a probabilistic graph represents just a statistical model, then edges, the connections between two nodes present in the graph, need not mean a dependence, no strong undirected or directed association. When a probabilistic graph, however, represents a research hypothesis, then no edge in the graph can be removed without introducing a further independence constraint in the distribution generated over the graph. And then we speak of an edge minimal graph. And edge minimality turned out to be essential for tracing paths in graphs and hence for understanding So I have to decide now what else I will be talking about. Sorry. Okay, let's start here. One eye-opening insight was for 2x2 tables, and it didn't get much attention, therefore, I think. In the literature or by colleagues. And it was by David Edwards who showed that dependencies for binary variables, if you just have two variables, will always depend on the margins or the main effects in the distribution if they are not functions of the odds ratios. This is why log linear models and logit regression became so important. And here are two simple measures of dependence. They did not translate well into the file, but it just means psi is the square root of the odds ratios, and then we get the coefficient of colligation as a simple transformation of this. And in symmetric Ising models, these taus turn into simple correlations, and this shows that simple correlations become odds ratios, become functions of the odds ratios, and hence satisfy what David Edwards had proven. And it generalizes to more variables. And one way...
You need to speak in there.
One way of generating Ising models is, Ising models were developed in Germany more than 100 years ago, and as one of the first papers to address it in the statistical literature was many years later. And symmetric Ising models were already studied by Barndorf and Nielsen, and he showed that when you have a symmetric extension, as I describe it here, you add to a 2x2 table, the counts in reverse order. Then you have also a minimal representation, but it was never used because nobody understood what it would give, this minimal representation. Whereas this symmetric Ising model is extremely useful. In particular, it is used in physics for having no external magnetic fields, and in the artificial intelligence literature. And it's also not only the 3x3 table, but every seeming symmetric Ising model is a palindromic distribution that comes from literature. So, some more recent updates of earlier works I will skip. I'm sorry that you got nervous. And I end again with David Cox's picture. That is the nicest I have. Thank you. Is that yours?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nanny. We will take questions at the end. So we're now I'm going to now invite Nancy Reid to come and speak. Nancy Reid studied at the University of Waterloo, the University of British Columbia, Stanford University, and Imperial College London. She joined the University of Toronto in 1986 and has held several leadership roles in statistical science, including scientific director of the Canadian Statistical Science Institute from 2015 to 19. Nancy is a fellow of the Royal Society, the Royal Society of Canada, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and a foreign associate of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2015, she was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada, and she is this year's winner of the Guy's Medal in Gold, and we will celebrate that tomorrow with her. She co-authored with David a book on the theory of design of experiment in 2000. Please, Nancy.
Thank you. This is a picture of David. Everyone has their own, I guess, drawer full of pictures, and so this is one of mine when he visited Toronto, just to mention that I was very fortunate that he visited Canada several times and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Toronto and also the University of Waterloo, among many, many other universities. I was remembering that Sylvia mentioned earlier that in 1984 was the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the RSS. There was a conference at which David spoke, and the paper here highlighted as the one he spoke on. But there was a reception to which the Queen and her husband came. And as I remember it, David was either president or past president, that I'm sure of, but it seemed that the Queen had to sign something as part of the formalities. And as I remember it, I think this is right, but people in the audience might correct me, she borrowed David's pen. So I remember writing him a little funny story about it afterwards that she kept it, but I don't think she did. Today, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of his early best papers, the Problems with Statistical Inference. And to mention that you should have these books on your shelf. But the first one, well, it's hard. They're both hard to read, but they both repay reading over many years, I could attest. So I highly recommend them. And so the most famous bit of his 1958 paper is this, at least in my mind, is this discussion of two weighing machines or two measurement instruments. One is quite precise, and one is not precise at all. And you flip a coin to decide which one to use, and you know which one that you've chosen. Okay, so obviously, you attach the variance of the estimate of mu that's appropriate for the machine that was chosen. If you chose the precise machine, then you use variance 1, and if you chose the imprecise machine, you use variance 1,000, even though the overall experiment has two parts. And if you're testing, if the mean is 0, then I would either use z is bigger than some quantile of the normal times 1, or times the square root of 1,000, depending how things turned out. But what he pointed out in this paper is that if you design the test that averages over the two machines, then unconditionally you can get higher power by doing so. Not for all values of mu, but for some values of mu. In the alternative space, you can get a more powerful test, basically by trading off, making your confidence interval a little bit wider when it's quite precise, and then making it narrower when it's less precise. You can get unconditional power that's lower, which was, I think, at that time quite surprising. Now it seems maybe more obvious. But it shows that there's a conflict between doing what's sensible and doing what, say, the development of the theory of powerful tests might suggest. And this was presented at an evening meeting of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, but I highlighted these two phrases from David's paper that he wrote about it, just to emphasize again his modesty. It consists of some general comments, few of them new, about statistical inference. He wrote, I reckon he wrote this, let's say he wrote it in 57, so he was, 35, so he was quite young. And I don't think many young people would have the courage to write a 30-page paper and claim that not very much of it was new in these days. But also, parts of the paper are controversial. These are not put forward in any dogmatic spirit, and I think that was very important at the time, and of course, a hallmark of David's approach to everything. There's much more in the paper than the weighing machine example, although that's the one that gets remembered. There's a very interesting discussion of the difference between statistical inference and scientific inference, also between statistical inference and decision theory, and a quite interesting discussion of Bayesian approaches as well, just kind of by the by. He says prior information that's not statistical cannot be included without abandoning the frequency theory of probability. And in a 2006 paper with Deborah Mayo, he investigated that in more detail. When we had the interview in 1994, he mentioned that the weighing machine example was deliberately designed to be extremely simple, almost obvious, to somehow extract the essence of the argument in this very stylized way. So it's easy to kind of, I think, overlook that example because it's almost too simple, but the principle applies in many modern settings as well. In linear regression or a generalized linear regression in very high dimensions, for example, which is quite popular now, you often hear people talking about fixed X versus model X, meaning do we condition on the X matrix or do we model it as a random variable? And in the context of the weighing machine example, it would be regarded as an ancillary statistic that didn't provide information about the coefficient beta. So it would be natural to use a conditional analysis. It comes up again in non-parametric and robust regression, and even in things like the de-biased lasso. In a different setting, it also comes up in many applications with nuisance parameters where the conditioning is a little bit designed for a slightly different purpose. It's usually to eliminate parameters, and this comes up in 2x2 tables that Nanny was just talking about in the Box-Cox model for regression and so on. Also in the same paper, and it's not even that long, but it might be 25 pages, there's extensive discussion of Fisher's fiducial argument, and this, I think, is the first time we see the proposal of a confidence distribution in the literature, which has been taken up in recent years by several authors trying to expand this notion of a confidence distribution. And in the 58 paper, he says it more clearly than most people writing since, statements made on the basis of this distribution, provided we are careful about their form, have a direct frequency interpretation. And he also notices, and we're still struggling with this, in many parameter problems, the single parameters for which confidence estimation is known to be possible are all very limited. There's a series of conferences under the rubric BFF for Bayesian, Fiducial, and Frequentist, pretending to be best friends forever. And the seventh such workshop was held in Toronto in May of this year, and many of these issues are being actively discussed at this series of workshops. Sylvia, how's my time? 5 minutes, okay. So I think I have time to show this confidence distribution in pictures because people often find it a bit puzzling, I think. So what I've drawn here is sketched here is a density with a particular value of theta. And I've imagined that we've observed a value of the data, y0. But I've shown the density for all possible values of y. And there's one theta value that I could choose that will make the area to the right of y0 exactly alpha. So I've called that, it's rather small. You might not see it at the back. It's theta sub y0 sup alpha. It's the theta value that gives us exactly alpha. But I could do that for a different value of alpha, alpha prime. That's the red curve. And there's another density that will give me alpha prime to the right of y0. So y0 is never changing. Only theta is changing, and it's moving the density function back and forth. And so now I have three values, and essentially we're just drawing out, and rather painfully slowly, a map from alpha and 0, 1 to all the parameter values. And if you invert that map, you have a confidence distribution. That's all it is. It's just all the different values of theta. So now on the right-hand plot, we're plotting against theta because y0 always stays fixed. So we're just inverting that map from alpha to theta back from theta to alpha, and that's a kind of distribution for theta. It starts at 0, it increases to 1. Well, I've set it up that way. I've pretended to set it up that way. It might go in the other direction, but the principle is still the same. As long as the transformation is monotone, that is, as long as we're careful, then we have something like a distribution. All possible confidence values are described by this. The same paper, still, a very clear discussion of significance tests as distinct from hypothesis testing. A p-value as a measure of consistency with the null hypothesis. we're still talking about this today, of course. This is a tweet from David Spiegelhalter, not today, it was about 3 years ago, bemoaning the fact that because p was equal to 0.06, the authors claimed they hadn't discovered anything. The ASA has been very active in trying to come to some type of consensus on p-values. There's been papers in Nature. There's a very interesting paper by Deborah Mayo in the Harvard Data Science Review, p-values on trial. So from 1958 till now, I guess the foundations of statistics are still puzzling and interesting and challenging and important. I just, for the younger audience, I think it might be easier to read more recent papers, but more than that, there are some really interesting ideas in the more recent papers that I think have not yet been exploited. And I wanted to mention two of them quickly. The first paper is Big Data and Precision, and David gave a lecture on this at his 90th birthday party, and he was absolutely in his element, as you can see from this picture. And this was quite, there were many interesting things about it, but it arose from a collaboration with medical researchers studying cystic fibrosis, and they had a very large data set, and David became convinced that the standard errors provided by the conventional models were too small, essentially because there was some dependence that's been overlooked, is the most likely explanation. And so this very short paper, 5 pages, 3 references, links this to the theory of long-range dependence. I think a very original and interesting development that I'm not sure is widely appreciated. Along the same vein, a little bit earlier, a paper with Manu Wong on a simple procedure for the selection of significant effects. He takes the simplest possible parametric formulation and studies both the likelihood interpretation or a likelihood analysis and a Bayesian analysis. And in 2 paragraphs, summarizes all the important points about multiple testing that you need to know. So again, 6 pages, 3 references. There's a lot between the lines, of course, but these are delightful papers to look at and think about, as are many of the others. His publication list is online at Nuffield College, and I urge you to pick one and read it and be delighted and surprised and learn something new. This is the cover of the special issue of Significance that Sylvia mentioned, and I was really proud of this excerpt from the interview and also very proud that it was on the cover. David said, in a sense, the only thing that matters is if you can look back when you reach a vast, vast, vast age. When he said this, he was 70. It doesn't quite seem as vast to me now as it did then. Have I done something reasonably in accord with my capability? If you can say yes, okay, my feeling is in one sense I've done that. And the part that's not on the cover, of course, is the follow-up. In another sense, I feel very dissatisfied. There are all sorts of problems that I nearly solved, and it goes on a little bit from there, and I find that very inspiring. I found it inspiring at the time, and it's carried me through the rest of my career, and I think it's a gem that he left us with that we can all draw inspiration from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm now going to call on our final speaker, Ruth Keogh. Ruth is a professor of biostatistics and epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She studied mathematics at the University of Edinburgh, and then she got a DPhil in statistics at the University of Oxford. Her current research programs is to apply and develop statistical causal inference methods using observational data. Ruth's other research interests include case control study design and analysis, method for handling missing data and measurement error, and causal inference methodology. In 2014, she co-authored an IMS monograph, Case Control Studies, with Sir David. Please, Ruth, can you come and join us to talk about David?
Thank you, Sylvia, for the nice introduction. It's an honour to be able to speak in this session, especially after Nanny and Nancy as well, and to be able just to say something about my memories of David and some of his work. The purpose of this slide is not to show you my CV, but just to explain to you my connection with David and where that originated. So I did my MSc in Applied Statistics in Oxford in 2002, and of course there's a summer project at the end of that, and I saw the list of projects, and I saw one on case control studies with some application in breast cancer research, and I thought that looks very interesting. It'd be very nice also that David was supervising that project, and he taught some of our courses. So I opted for that one and was very lucky to be allocated it. And it's probably one of those moments I think you look back on and you don't quite realise what impact that's going to have on what you do, everything you do later. Some point during that summer project, I was thinking about what to do next, and I remember asking David, would you supervise my PhD project if I did that? And I think I remember him saying at the time, maybe. And at some point, I'm not sure what I did, but anyway, he agreed that he would supervise my PhD, which was also on this topic of case control studies, design and analysis. I think probably it's a good job. I didn't quite appreciate at the time when I was doing my master's degree quite how famous and influential David was. Otherwise, I think I would have been too nervous to ask him. So, and then that resulted in this book in 2014, which was partly based on some of the work I did in my PhD thesis. And as you can imagine, it was a great experience working with David on that book. So I wasn't quite sure what to talk about today. There's so many possibilities, but I thought I'd stick to what I know and talk a bit about the Cox model, which we've already heard about a bit from Sylvia, and a bit about principles of applied statistics, because I'm a very applied statistician, I think. So here's the paper on the Cox model, which, as I say, we've already heard about, published in 1972 in the JRSS, and with this quite modest title of Regression Models and Life Tables. This was an article, I think, from 2014 in Nature, which was about the top 100 scientific papers, and I think this came in at number 24. Although I think probably the true number of citations is much greater than is recorded. Even though David was an extremely modest person, I do remember him saying, I think, that no one even cites my paper anymore. And as we've already heard, it was for this work that David was awarded the International Prize in Statistics in 2016. And this is a different quote from the chair of that foundation. And she said, "Professor Cox changed how we analyse and understand the effect of natural or human-induced risk factors on survival outcomes, paving the way for powerful scientific inquiry and discoveries that have impacted human health worldwide. Use of the Cox model in the physical, medical, life, earth, social and other sciences, as well as engineering fields, has yielded more robust and detailed information that has helped researchers and policymakers address some of society's most pressing challenges." Of course, David was far too modest to ever refer to this model as the Cox model or the Cox regression model. I did hear him call it the so-called proportional hazards model sometimes. This is a comment from David taken from a comment on another paper, which I'll reference later. And I'm not sure how entirely happy he was with the way that the proportional hazards model had become the default choice for survival analysis. I think one reason perhaps being that the proportional hazards aspect of his model wasn't the only feature of this paper. And he said, in the paper, often quoted but probably rarely read, that introduced this approach, there was a comparison of several of the many different models that might be suitable for this kind of data. So this was one of the reasons why I thought I'd just go through briefly in this talk some of the things that feature in this paper. Just some of the background to this paper, which comes from Nancy's interview with David. I've taken quite a few quotes from David in this talk. he said quite a few people said they were getting a certain kind of data, censored survival data with a lot of explanatory variables. We heard this in the earlier interview with Hastie and Tibshirani as well. Nobody knew quite how to handle this sort of data in a reasonably general way, and there seemed to be a dissatisfaction with assuming an underlying exponential or Weibull distribution modified by some factor, and it seemed that something slightly more general was called for. So here's just a general definition of a hazard or age-specific failure rates given at the top there. And this is an excerpt taken from that 1972 paper. David was thinking of a set of covariates, which he called Z, observed on some individuals. And he said right from the beginning of the paper, the Zs might be functions of time. And he said that the main problem considered in this paper is that of assessing the relation between the distribution of failure time and these Z variables. And he did that using this well-known hazard model now, which he denoted lambda. So that comprises this baseline hazard, lambda 0 of t, and then this multiplying factor, e to the beta z. He then quickly goes on to give 4 examples, which I'll just go through briefly. He started simple with a 2-sample problem, two populations, one of which z is 0 and the other z is 1. And in one, the hazard is given by this baseline, lambda 0, and in the other, it's multiplied by some factor, which it's convenient to call e to the beta, which keeps the hazard positive. In the second example, he was thinking still about these 2 populations, but with an extended treatment where we have this second covariate, Z2, which is just the first binary covariate multiplied by time. So already in this second example, thinking about time-varying associations. And then there are some further examples, adding in another covariate and extending to a more general regression setting. This is quite brief. This is all the paper says about regression. I think David's papers are well known for being concise. He just said the connection between failure time and regressive variables can be explored in an obvious way. Although he did add, note especially by introducing functions of t, effects other than constant multiplication of the hazard can be included. So having defined this model, the Cox model, the question arose as how to actually estimate the parameters of this model. So he said in his interview with Nancy, then the question was to how to actually do the statistical analysis. I wrote down the full likelihood and was horrified at it because it's got exponentials of integrals of products of all sorts of things, unknown functions and so forth, and I was stuck there for quite a long time. And after this, there's quite a fun and interesting story about, I think, how David was stuck on this perhaps for some years and how the solution came to him while he was ill. So I won't recount that here, but it's a really interesting thing to read about. So he came up with this solution. Here's the model again given at the top. He said, suppose that this baseline hazard lambda 0 is arbitrary. And it seemed obvious to him that no information can be contributed about these parameters beta from time intervals where there were no events. And so he said, we therefore argue conditionally on the set ti of event times. And so for a particular event that occurs at a particular time ti and conditional on the set of, the risk set, so the set of people who were eligible to have the event at that time, the probability that the event actually occurred on the person that we observe is given by this ratio. And the neat thing about this is that it includes the baseline hazard in the top and the bottom, and that just cancels out. And we're left with this conditional expression that only includes these parameters beta of interest. And then we just take the product of all these things over all the event times to get our conditional, what he called in that paper, a conditional likelihood. And there weren't that many details in this 1972 paper about this likelihood. He took quite an intuitive approach to deriving that. But more details came in this 1975 paper in Biometric on Partial Likelihood. And in the literature by David and others, there have been, of course, many further developments and discussion about the asymptotic properties of estimates obtained from the Cox model. Something else that perhaps is not appreciated about the 1972 paper is that it's not all about estimating hazard ratios, even as functions of time, but there's also a section on estimating the distribution of failure times, i.e. survival probabilities or risks. And David gave an expression, semi-parametric expression for that. And in the discussion, there were some more suggestions about how to do that. And I think that the default approach is using Breslau's method now, which was described in the discussion of the paper. There's also a very nice example in the paper, which comes from leukemia patients. And again, maybe I've probably emphasized this too much now, but again, he gave an example where he wanted to examine possible departures from proportionality of hazards. And the Cox model, I think in the intervening years, decades, has resulted in a huge amount of methodological development in a number of areas. So in case control studies, which was an area that we were interested in for our book, competing risks, joint models for longitudinal processes and time to event processes, causal inference methods, and more recently, integration with machine learning approaches. Just in this second shorter part, I wanted to say a little bit about David's work on the principles of applied statistics. So David is, I guess, most well known for all his theoretical work, but he's also done or been involved in a lot of applied work in a lot of different areas. I think this reflects his generosity to students and colleagues as well. I'm sure people contacted him all the time and asked him to be involved in these studies. So just some examples. He's done work in AIDS and HIV, on rainfall, on educational attainment, so sociological applications, and some well-known work that I remember him talking a lot about when I was a PhD student, I think it was going on at that time, around bovine TB in cattle and badgers. And there's this nice review article on that in Significance magazine, and that was work with Crystal Donnelly, among others. I was lucky to be able to work with David and others on cystic fibrosis, which Nancy mentioned in her talk. And here's some nice photos of us in Nuffield College in Oxford, where we spent a number of weeks over some different visits with colleagues, clinical colleagues from the US who had interesting data on patients with cystic fibrosis, and they were also wanting to plan collection of new data. I just picked out this other quote from Nancy's interview with David, where Nancy asked, "Do you sit down and fool with data much?" And he replied, "I sit down and make suggestions to other people as to what to do, and sometimes I hover annoyingly over them when they do it. But I can assure you this was a great experience and nothing annoying about it." Review papers were also mentioned by Sylvia, and David wrote 2 or 3, or probably more, review papers on the topic of applied statistics, including this one from 2007. And here he said, "What are the central principles of applied statistics? The great variety of the fields in which statistical considerations play some part makes it hazardous to attempt an answer. Any simple recommendation along the lines, in applications one should do so and so, is virtually bound to be wrong, or in some, or indeed possibly many contexts. On the other hand, descent into a yawning abyss of vacuous generalities is all too possible." So I think David he wasn't keen on sort of recommending strict ways on which to do things, but he did have a number of broad recommendations on the principles of applied statistics, which appear in this another really nice book with Crystal Donnelly on that topic. So they said in that book it's helpful to think about a number of broad components to statistical ideas. So starting with formulation of research questions, search for data, perhaps some design and implementation of investigations to get data, analysis, and finishing off with interpretation and translation into subject matter context. This is also an interesting piece to read on the topic of applied statistics. There is this, I think, also very well-known paper from Ryman on statistical modelling the two cultures, which had a series of comments after it from 2001 from David and a number of other eminent statisticians. And David was such a nice person, but I did get the feeling that he wasn't too keen on this paper based on his comment. He said in his comment, Professor Bryman takes data as his starting point. I would prefer to start with an issue, a question, or a scientific hypothesis. These issues may evolve or even change radically as analysis proceeds. Data looking for a question are not unknown and raise puzzles, but are, I believe, atypical in most contexts. I just wanted to finish with some of the main things which seem very simple but important that I feel I've learned from David on how to do applied statistics. So I think one of the main things I learned is to try and be sensible. He would often ask after we'd been to a seminar, do you think it was sensible, or was what they said sensible? And to make things as complicated as they need to be, but not overcomplicating things. He said, if a simple standard model is adequate to answer the subject matter question, this is fine. There are severe hidden penalties for over-elaboration. And this was a quote which we already heard, totally by coincidence. I chose the same quote from the end of the talk that we saw in the video that was shown earlier. Just to finish, let me say that it's 50 years since the Cox model paper was published, 1972, and we're going to celebrate this in an event at the LSHTM in November, and registration is open for this, and this is being generously co-hosted by the RSS and also by the stats departments in Oxford and Imperial. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, David.
For these, all these three presentations. We have now a few minutes to see if there's any questions. Or you may ask, you could just get up and give your name, and I think there's a microphone that you could share if you. So, are there any questions, suggestion, or any anecdote you would like to share with us? There's just a few minutes before we close this session. I don't really see very well. Ruth, yes.
My question for Nanny was about the graphical models that you described and about the connection with causal diagrams or directed acyclic graphs. The connection between your graphical models and directed acyclic graphs, and what David's views were on the connection between those things.
I think it's funny as it works. It's not easy to answer that question. As you saw on my slide that you could see, we didn't always agree on things. If I draw my most important reconfiguration with the responses on the left, he would always draw it on the right, the responses. If we had little results, David was extremely hardworking and never worked just with one co-author. And so he always picked some questions from the field of graphical Markov models and found a nice explanation himself for the questions that were of interest. That is good.
I see somebody. You'd have to go to the microphone there on the right-hand side, please. Please state your name. It's very hard to see anyone in there.
Hello. Thank you for your wonderful talks and insights on David. Personal insights. I'm a PhD student, and this is more of a funny question. Did he have a preferred statistical programming language?
I don't know why the microphone has been passed to me, but in the work that we did in cystic fibrosis, we did that using R. I think there was a lot of sitting in front of the computer and our clinical collaborators were quite keen on showing all the R analysis and output on a big screen that we can all see. And I think David was quite amazed, maybe in a way, about the computational power that is available now. But I also know that he didn't like some of the output that you saw. He said, oh, there's a lot of emphasis on p-values in this output. I remember him saying that.
You have to remember that David never used programming himself. It was always co-authors who did the programming. So he did not have any preferred references from these. And his way of finding questions that he could solve, it never involved programming.
Just to add to that, Heather Batty mentioned at her presentation at the Joint Statistical Meetings that when she sent David tables of numbers, he'd always find something interesting in them that she hadn't noticed.
And now I have remote questions for whoever wants to. I think maybe, what would David have considered the greatest unsolved problem in statistics? And is Azir?
The exciting thing with research is that each time you solve a problem, you open up 10 unsolved problems. So,
Yeah, that's the right answer. Yes.
David, all these tributes, and so I'm going to draw this session to a close and thank the three speakers to have shared their memory and their wisdom with us.